Hello everybody, this is the week 5 video for NRS 123 for the lecturer's guide. I'm going to use the PowerPoint because I happen to have put this week's one together for the online class already, so I'll just use this one to go through if that's okay. The activities are identical. So in this week we're looking at healthcare information, and specifically really we're talking about privacy and confidentiality and how they apply to healthcare records and things. So if you just flick through and mention to the students they need to be preparing, I've sent out an announcement to all students today talking to them about the need to come prepared. I understand that some classes are doing this really well and some classes not so much. So you might direct them to the announcement, particularly if they're not reading the stuff, you're finding that they're not really aware of what's going on. In this, I've got that wrong, sorry, I haven't updated that one, but in this week we're looking at the concepts of privacy and confidentiality and how they apply to nursing. So in the first activity it's just going through what's called a conceptual review to review the things they should have done in the readings in the lecture. So this one is talking about what are the healthcare records used for, and this is sort of a summary from Staunton and Chiarella, which is their prescribed text. So it's an ongoing account of the patient's healthcare experience, the transition to the next stage of treatment from one department to another or from one shift to another, a record, excuse me, of the treatment given, a record of progress made in their health, a record of their health history for future consultation, and the records used for teaching, quality and research purposes. And I've got a better, longer, more comprehensive list of that that I use in 112, but that's certainly sufficient for our purposes today to talk about what a healthcare record is and what it's for. The key point, I think, is that the main part of it is to make sure there's no gaps in care between one healthcare professional and the next, and then it's got a lot of other secondary purposes. So moving on, what's the difference between privacy and confidentiality? So these are two quotes taken out of the New South Wales Health Privacy Manual. You need to have a squeeze through that. I wouldn't read, it's quite a big document, so you don't need to read through all of it, but when you're trying to prepare for the lesson, you're looking at the questions, a lot of them will be taken out of the Privacy Manual almost verbatim. So towards the first part, I think it's the first chapter in that Privacy Manual, the first section, it gives definitions for these two different points. So privacy refers to the right of an individual to have their personal health information safeguarded from loss, misuse and unauthorised disclosure in order to protect the privacy of an individual's personal information. So it's about making sure that it doesn't get out there at all. And confidentiality is a professional duty or a promise between a health practitioner and his or her patient that places restrictions on the disclosure of information provided by the patient. So it's about only sharing the information with people that you're supposed to and the people who are authorised to have it. It talks about the duty of confidentiality is not absolute, and we'll be looking at specific circumstances where nurses are legally allowed and required to disclose that to others. Some examples of situations, you'll have your own. I didn't have, there's not a specific list of this, I've just written in some suggestions of where I found it hard to maintain confidentiality. You might have your own specific examples where that's been the case. I've put in where there's shared rooms, so 4 beds in one room. Or 2 beds, and also urgent situations can be more difficult to maintain confidentiality when things get emotional, like end-of-life care, when paediatric patients are involved, when I was planning to talk to the students around pretty much any time you're in hospital, the person's having the worst week or month or whatever of their life, and there's usually a lot of emotion around it, and it can be more difficult to withhold information from people when you're legally required to under those circumstances. When there's issues involved in custody, so if you've been informed that you're only allowed to tell one parent about stuff and not the other parent based on custody issues, that can be hard as well. Whenever the patient's vulnerable, so paediatric patients, end-of-life care situations, confidentiality issues around the Guardianship Act and whether patients are allowed to know things and where withholding information from some people but not others can be challenging. Infection control can be difficult, and I was going to talk about the contrast between needing to do things like having the transmission-based precautions and putting those up on the wall and saying, look, this patient has a need for you to wear this stuff, without actually saying patient has VRE written all over the wall, and the need to balance this person's right for confidentiality against the need to protect other people. So I was planning to discuss that in some extent. Inmates, and sometimes where it can be really difficult, where you know something particularly distasteful or unpleasant about a person, and how difficult that can be to keep that to yourself around, I've looked after child molesters and people, other sort of issues with inmates and other non-inmate people that have sort of had issues about their person that I found a little bit difficult to manage, and keeping that to yourself and knowing things that you know can be quite difficult. So that's another situation when information is interesting. So when you've got the goss, when you've got something saucy, and you know something really interesting, gossip about the person, and how that can be more difficult to be maintaining confidentiality and the need to be professional. When information explains nursing care of other patients. So I've got an example where if I've been delayed in responding to a buzzer that someone's pressed, and I come in and they say, well, where have you been? I've been ages. I say, I'm sorry, I've been busy looking after our other patients. Is really is all as much as you'd be allowed to say, because you can't say, look, I'm sorry, the person next door just died and I had to, grieve with the family and all that sort of stuff. You're limited in being able to explain the situation properly, and even when other patients are getting frustrated that you've been not coming anywhere near me, if there's a complaint put in against you and all that sort of stuff, when there is actually a perfectly valid explanation for what you've been doing, the difficulty of maintaining confidentiality in that situation. Handover sheets, which I've got an example I was going to share with the students online. You might just describe the concept to your students around the idea of having handover information written down somehow, because of how hard it is to maintain it all in your head, and then the issues that potentially opens up if a person was to take a handover sheet home and lose it, for example. And we had that in Wagga once when I was relatively new as an RN, and someone had lost a handover sheet downtown, and it sort of got around and caused a big problem in town. So the issue around confidentiality, balancing the need to be able to track a lot of information about the patients you've been allocated against the need to maintain privacy and confidentiality. And then just generally bedside handover or discussions about a patient in the vicinity of other patients can be difficult. So, for example, where you've done a rapid response or some other version of you've asked for a consult, a doctor or some other multidisciplinary team members come in to talk to you about your patient, and it's hard to do that well sometimes with other patients around. But again, you'll have your own situations and that's fine. The next question is, what are the legal, ethical and professional standards? So the legal issue is around, it's discussed in the privacy manual, goes through about 5 or 6 different laws. The 2 primary ones are the Healthcare Records Information Protection Act, I think it's called. I can't remember what the PPIP one stands for, but it's in the privacy manual, so open that up and show them the different legislation that's relevant. You don't have to go through it in huge detail, but it's good to show them that the privacy manual is where they'll find all that information. Professional includes obviously the whole document of the privacy manual is the standard that an RN would be held against. So anything that's in that manual becomes the professional standard for the nurses. Then what does the RN Standards for Practice say? It includes in the RN Standards for Practice that you'll abide by legislation, and it also talks about confidentiality more specifically. And then what does the Code of Conduct say? Section 3.5 is relevant to this as well. And then having a look at ethical perspectives, what does the Code of Ethics say about it? And then also the ethical principles, they really apply to all of them. So autonomy is relevant because the person's got a right to make decisions about themselves. That's what autonomy is. And then if you breach their privacy and keep their information, that was their decision to give that information to somebody else. So you've breached their ethical right to make decisions about what happens to their information. Justice could be relevant in the sense that you might be happy to release some people's information but not others. So a good example might be having all the information up in a residential aged care facility about everything to do with that person, and you wouldn't dare think about doing that with people in their 30s and 40s and having all their continents and all that sort of stuff up on the board, but because they're older people it's fine. So that's the sort of concept where justice would be relevant, that making sure that we're happy that we're maintaining conduct in a way that would be fair across the rest of society. And then beneficence, non-maleficence. Sharing information needs to be of benefit to the patient, and it needs to be not harming the patient. So it's good to open a bit of a chat about how releasing information about a person, even if it's true, can be harmful to that person, can be damaging to their personal relationships, could end up with them losing their job, all sorts of stuff. But there'd be different ways that a person's information, even true information, it's theirs to release unless there's a reason to, and we've got a legal requirement to do that. So the non-maleficence issue is you can be causing them harm by releasing information. Next bit is, under what circumstances are we permitted to breach the patient's confidentiality? So the privacy manual goes through this, talks about, and this is directly taken from that, so accessing information that's been requested under a court subpoena or search warrant, if the warrant's been provided. Release of a discharge summary to a patient's GP where the patient and or their authorised representative has provided the GP's details. So it specifically says in the privacy manual, if you're in a hospital and you say, my doctor is Dr. Smith, that you have consented to Dr. Smith getting a record of your hospital stay. For current and future ongoing care and treatment purposes where the patient has been generally made aware of their information will be used this way. So as part of it's worth discussing with the students around when you're admitting a patient that you're different health services do this differently, but it's important to make sure that patients are made aware that they're giving their information and it will be shared amongst the people that are going to be providing care for them in the healthcare team. To use and disclose of patients' genetic information is permitted to their genetic relatives in certain circumstances. So it goes through that in that particular section of the privacy manual. It's quite complicated, but you can just leave it at sometimes patients, other relatives that are directly related to that patient have a right to be able to get genetic information about that person for their own benefit. And then in emergency situations, so the example I gave last year was around if a fire happened in the hospital and the fire warden or someone involved in that evacuation came along and asked you for details about the patient, that it would be legal for you to disclose what you need to get the patients safe. So you could talk about their previous health conditions, you could talk about their mobility and all that sort of stuff to help them get out of the fire. So they're examples as well. There's also a general rule, it hasn't been mentioned there in that list I don't think, but there's other reasons in terms of statutory obligations like mandatory reporting and public health risks, notifiable health conditions and things as well. Bedside handovers and confidentiality. So this is an article Linda Starr wrote about bedside handovers and confidentiality, and just talks about the balancing between including patients in their handover but also maintaining confidentiality and how difficult that is. So I've asked some questions for the students. So why has bedside handover become such a growing trend? I discussed it in my group around the balance between patient-centred care against patient confidentiality, and historically handovers didn't tend to involve patients, and their care was subsequently less patient-centred as a result, because if they're a passive recipient of their care because we haven't even included in the conversation around what we're planning to do for the day, I think handover is a really important moment where you're trying to involve the patient in discussions about the plans and their decisions that will be made about their healthcare. So the need to have the patient present when you're trying to have handover is a patient-centred care issue. Obviously, if you try to have handover in a 4-bedded room and you do all of the handover there and you don't take any consideration into discretion and stuff, that you have a big issue with patient confidentiality as well. So the current set up in a lot of places is to have a bit of a balancing act between these two concepts and be looking after, trying to include the patient as much as you can in that conversation without exposing information that would be inappropriate or illegal to share with others. So it's a good point to discuss that. In relation to this activity, what are the inherent risks to nurses from a legal and professional perspective? So this article outlines these points. It talks about the Privacy Act and that it's a breach of contract, that a patient has come into hospital and said, yes, you can have my information, but you're only authorised to share it with people that, as we've discussed in the previous activity, that should be involved in my care. Obviously, the patient in the next bed is not involved in their care, so it's you're breaching the contract that you've sort of started with that patient. That you have a fiduciary relationship, you owe them a duty of care to maintain their confidentiality, and if you're breaching that, obviously you're falling below the standard that's accepted. It talks in the article about the 3 different ways that nurses can be brought on, or have civil proceedings brought against them. So it can be for defamation, can be for breach of contract, it can also be for negligence. So there are 3 aspects through the law that they can be have a civil charge brought against them. Not a civil charge, a civil suit brought against them. And then for disciplinary proceedings, the nurse can be brought up on professional misconduct or unsatisfactory professional conduct charges. So there are different aspects of what could happen if we're doing bedside handovers poorly. So then how do the nurses take steps? I'd ask the students to try, this is more just a common sense thing, and asking them for thinking about how they might go about this. And if they haven't seen handover at all, this is a difficult conversation to have. But you might have students amongst your group that are happy to talk about how they've seen handover done and the better and the not so good ways of doing that. I've suggested things like discretion, lowering your voice and not speaking particularly loud, requesting consent to discuss patient details. So you might start off the handover with, we're just going to do handover here. I'm just going to hand over to Jane. You're happy that I talked to her about your care, and including that consent, and then limiting your discussion to what you've had consent for. To have a bit of situational awareness and be sort of present when you're handing over and thinking about, okay, well, who's behind the curtain? How many people have I got around? If it's a crowded room, is there a lot of people around here? Do we need to have this many people around here while we're trying to do handover? That sort of stuff. Having a think about the environment. Consider having some of the handover away from public. So there's possibility, I've talked about, you'll have some experience yourself, obviously, with handing over sensitive information like sexual health history and stuff like that in a treatment room or somewhere else if you need to, depending on the environment you're working in. But it's usually possible to have part of the handover somewhere else. It's not necessary to have all of the handover at the bedside. I've got an example of handover sheets, which I'll include in the email. I'll send it out to you guys if you want to use it. But for people that have never heard of handover and never seen it and stuff, it can be useful to have a mocked up handover sheet to show them what they might sort of come across in the hospital. And also role modelling good behaviour. So it's part of our job to be giving handover well, but also if you're seeing if the person giving you handover is ignoring some of this stuff, or you might have a doctor or someone else that's blurting this stuff out, and you might have seen it yourself, where another healthcare worker is saying some fairly personal stuff about the patient, and they're thinking that the curtain is somehow a magical sound barrier from the next bed, that you might mention to the colleague, look, it's important that we're maintaining confidentiality, which can be a difficult conversation to have, but is important and part of our role as well. So that's that activity. The next one is a case which you might be familiar with. Was a prank that happened in 2014. The details of which, if you go and have a read of that link, there's just a news article that takes you through it. So the first point is to summarise the tragic event. So the royal couple had a baby, it's William and Kate had a baby. The radio host was Mel G. She called the hospital with another radio DJ, and she was impersonating the Queen. The call got put through to the supervising nurse of the hospital, and that supervising nurse, she was the in charge or however they described her, has then transferred the call to the nurse caring for the patient on the ward. So the supervisor wasn't present on the ward, she was running around. I think she was the after hours manager, and she put the call through to the nurse caring for the patient. The RN disclosed private information to the DJ thinking she was the Queen, without consent of the patient. And investigation and a lot of media coverage ensued, and then the RN committed suicide as a result. So in terms of a case, the important part of this is, even if it is the Queen, literally, you think it's the Queen calling, that it's still appropriate to get consent or to be handing the phone over and getting the patient to talk to the Queen rather than you trying to disclose information. And I've talked last year about how difficult this conversation would need to be. I mean, to be willing to say, I'm sorry, even if you are the Queen, I need to go and ask for consent first, would obviously be really difficult, but it's necessary, and there'd be a way to do that well. But even if it's not the Queen calling, that it can be really pressing when someone's eager to know information about their sick relative or who you think is the person calling, and that RNs have a responsibility to still push back and go, no, I'm sorry, I need to get consent for that. What should the DJ actually do? They need to get consent from the patients to disclose the information, or they should refuse to disclose the information without consent. They should hand the phone over to the patient. It would have been a logical thing to do. ask them, look, I've got a phone call, I think it's Her Majesty the Queen calling, would you like to take that call? And I'm sure the three of the people around would have thought that was quite funny and would have said, no, that won't be her. That I'm sure they would have had a protocol. It's bizarre that the hospital wouldn't have had some process that the hospital would have been following while these guys were here. I think they must have royals in regularly, and it would be bizarre that they wouldn't have a predetermined protocol on what they should be doing, and that it was important to follow that. And also that the nurse needed to develop assertiveness, that it's important that nurses are willing to stand up and say no when they know something's not quite right, which is very difficult but important. I just missed a question here. So the previous question to that was reflecting on the activities in the activity 1 that we did. Who's responsible for the breach of confidentiality? So obviously the parents of the patient didn't know about it and they weren't responsible at all. The nurse caring for the patient shared some of the blame. I think the nurse in charge of the hospital was in a position to stop that. The hospital in general, if they didn't have a protocol, didn't have a process in which to protect that person's privacy better, would be possibly to blame as well. And the radio host as well has obviously committed a crime and gained information that she shouldn't have that belonged to somebody else. But yeah, the important part in that situation was that the patients obviously weren't the people that were to blame. Okay, so the next activity is the Johnny Rocker one. This is pulling that privacy manual apart a bit more detail. So make sure you've had a look at that. This is Johnny Rocker. He's a famous rock star who was semi-conscious after having drugs and alcohol, and then he comes into hospital and a reporter calls the hospital to find out about him. So looking at the privacy manual, what can you answer to each of the questions? Obviously, I'm sorry, I'm not able to disclose personal information over the telephone. Are you required to do anything else? It makes sense to communicate with the NUM or the Director of Nursing to escalate the issue, because it's likely that they're going to keep getting phone calls and they want to establish a bit of a plan of attack for that. That there'd be a media relations officer that might be involved. They can be really useful around how they're going to frame a response, if they were going to frame a response, or to remind people of the policy and to get a bit of control over that. But you need to document it and hand over to the next shift, and you might do an incident report as well. How would you respond if the caller identifies herself not as a reporter but as a close friend of Johnny's? So it's helpful to look at Section 9 of the Privacy Manual. It gets really specific around what you can and can't say over the telephone and how you would identify who the person is calling and all that sort of stuff. It's obviously important to make the point, whether it's a close friend or his sister or anybody, that we can't tell that just because she says so, that she may very well still be a Sunday Telegraph person calling, that we need to identify who she is properly. So the manual goes through how to do that. If you look at Section 9, it's quite specific. So pull that open and have a look, and that's the answer to the question. The story then goes on and says that there's a deceased person at his house, and that the police are trying to find out more about the story and trying to ask the nurse for information, and then asking them, okay, well, what does the privacy manual say about this? And reflecting on the responses that they've done previously, can you tell the police everything that's happened that Johnny's told you about, and who would you seek advice before you answer any questions? So the Privacy Manual talks about referring to someone senior in the hospital. You haven't officially been notified of the need to disclose information, so Privacy Manual gets into specifics around that the police can't just say, I want to know this information. They have to provide a warrant to you. So if the warrant hasn't been provided and it's a casual conversation with the police officer, that the nurse actually shouldn't disclose this yet. Reflecting on the responses from Activity 1, can you report your conversation with Johnny when he specifically said that he's told you not to and it's regarded as confidential? It's the same point as above. You might also pull apart the issue of because the person has already died, you can't argue that telling them would be in the public's best interest to start off with, that the urgent need to call if there was an unconscious person that's very unwell at his house and you know about that, that'd be a very different story to someone that's been found deceased. That the urgency around trying to rescue her and save her life wouldn't be present anymore. So it's a tricky situation that they would need a lot of support for, shouldn't be trying to make this decision by themselves. But the Privacy Manual actually direct them to request a warrant rather than to start blurting stuff out. Who could you seek advice from? I mentioned last year talking about obviously establishing a lawyer, or they may have given you one from the health service, might have provided you with legal support. I talked to the students about you might decide that that's all well and good, but the interests of the hospital may not particularly align with the interests of you at some point, and that having your own law advice might be quite useful. I also mentioned that sometimes people get the union involved and try to get union representatives to help them out if they're stuck in a pickle. If they're a union member, I think the union's usually happy to represent non-union members in this sort of situation as well. But yeah, it's worth mentioning that there's a few different alternatives. It's important to get the health service executive involved early, and as a previous member, as a manager, the earlier that you're included in decisions and discussions, the more effective you can be and the more helpful you can be. So it's not about being scared about telling bosses and things, it's about getting them included so they can help you manage the situation well. So it's good to suggest that to the students, that looking at your executive as a way of being able to help you through the situation rather than being scared to talk to them about it is a better way to go. So that's the end of the tutorial, and there's not much else to say about this week. Thanks guys.